All right, I'm gonna go as quick as I can because I've got quite a bit to explain with this particular video. So this review is actually going to be a series in and of itself because there are quite a bit of different books from this universe to go over. But I'm just going to stick with one of the trilogies for today, and this is actually the trilogy in which I was introduced to this particular universe, and that's the Shadowhunters novels. But interestingly enough, all of these books combined are a bit of a multiversal story that takes place across a couple of hundred years, pretty much. And like I said, I'm starting with the trilogy that introduced me to this series, and it's not exactly the one that you have to start with. But the interesting thing that Cassandra Clare has done with her books is that she's written multiple trilogies that exist in the same universe, and you can literally pick any one of those trilogies and enter into this universe with that trilogy. And you don't necessarily have to go in chronological order when you read her books. However, there is a main six-book series that is comprised of two trilogies that follow more of a main group of characters, if you will. But that's another video. So today we are going to be reviewing the Infernal Devices trilogy. And each book has its own unique name, of course. But of course, we're going to start with Clockwork Angel. Now, this particular trilogy, if I remember correctly, takes place in the late 1800s in London. So, a bit of a backstory of the type of universe this is. It's very sci fi fantasy oriented, and you have multiple different races of people that exist within this universe. You have vampires and werewolves, but the interesting thing about Cassandra Clare is that she has a way of explaining how these races exist. And I'll go into more of that later. So you have vampires, werewolves, you have fairies from the land of Fae, pretty much. You have warlocks, and then you have the Shadowhunters. Now, the way she explained these is that Shadowhunters are a race that exists from the Bible. They are half human and half angel, and another name they go by is Nephilim, which you can actually find in the Bible. And the vampires and werewolves are people with demon diseases. So the vampires are infected with this disease that pretty much causes them to die. It causes their bodies to be more susceptible to flame, but they have to drink blood in order to survive. Then you have the werewolves, which is another demon disease. And I can't really remember if they actually gain control of their condition at some point, but obviously with both vampire and werewolves you have all those drawbacks, but you also have things like super strength as well to go along with it. However, the vampires might be immortal, but the werewolves are not. Then you have the warlocks, and those are people that are half human, half demon. So one of their parents was a demon of some sort, and you also have a higher level of warlock that was fathered by a greater demon. And I'll get into more of the different classes of demons as well. But you also have the Fae and all that, and those are creatures that come in all shapes and sizes, and they're not as, fun-loving sunshine and butterflies as you may typically see in stories. They are half angel and half demon, and they are incapable of lying. However, they will twist and turn their words. Even if they are telling the truth, they will twist it and turn it to achieve whatever their goal might be at the time. And they are very capable at driving humans insane, and really just don't take much. But they kind of live in their own dimension, but they're able to come into our dimension. Then you have the race of mundanes, and that's just your normal everyday human, your average Joe. And so basically, the Shadowhunters, or the Nephilim, have the objective of keeping the mundanes unaware of Downworld. And Downworld is a term that they use to describe, the community of vampires, werewolves, warlocks, the Fae, all of that. So they try to keep the mundanes unaware of their existence. And on top of that, they are constantly battling the demonic threat that is threatening to infiltrate and overtake, their world, pretty much. So you have a race of demons that come in all shapes and sizes and breeds and all these other things. And they're basically all these animal like monstrous creatures. They're not very intelligent, but they're brutal, and they can be directed by the actions of a greater demon. Now, a greater demon is a demon that's obviously more powerful, capable of sentient thought and making plans, having goals. And the majority of the greater demons that you encounter in these stories are fallen angels that fell from heaven with Lucifer. You have the nine princes of hell that each have their own goals, and they typically take the form of a human in a dark colored suit, but their face can sometimes be monstrous, but they also have their own monstrous forms that they can take and be terrifying. But anytime you encounter a greater demon in one of these stories, it's always fascinating of a just a criminal mind that you're encountering there, just the level of forethought they're able to put into things, just how sinister they can be and how they are described. It's really terrifying. But outside of that, those are kind of like the basics as far as what exists in the world, and I can go into other things as well. There's also higher classes of shadow hunters as well. People that decide to take on a higher purpose and self-sacrifice. You have on the boys' side, you have Silent Brothers, and they're a terrifying group that sew their eyes and mouths shut and take on. They can also withstand more powerful runes, and that's another thing I didn't describe, is that the Shadow Hunters basically tattoo themselves with angelic runes or marks that give them various different abilities in order to give them an edge in fighting in a battle, pretty much. And that can include super strength, super eyesight, super healing, things of that nature. And so the Silent Brothers can withstand runes that are even more powerful. And there's a whole process in which, you know, shadow hunters ascend to being a full shadow hunter. There's ways mundanes can become shadow hunters, but it's quite the grueling process, and not everybody makes it out of that alive. But basically, there's certain marks that you have to put on your body first before you can withstand having others placed on your body, or you'll die pretty much. Now, the Silent Brothers basically are the healers of the Shadowhunter community, and they're basically these monks that live in this dark, cavernous city called the Silent City. And they're also charged with the knowledge of the shadow hunters and everything, and they basically run a lot of different rite of passage events that shadow hunters go through, like becoming a full shadow hunter, receiving their first marks, even weddings shadow silent brothers are in charge of. They're also in charge of the parabatai ceremony, and I'll get into more of that later. But basically, it's a ceremony that binds two shadow hunters together in a brotherly bond or sisterly bond, and it's supposed to be a thing that connects them together more so than that of even marriage. Like they're able to draw off of each other's energy in battle and almost guess what the other's thinking. Like the connection is that deep and strong. Now, on the ladies' side, you have the group of Iron Sisters, and they are the metal workers of the Shadow Hunters, and they live up in their citadel in a volcanic plain. And they, so basically, women can't become Silent Brothers, and men can't become Iron Sisters. They're all exclusive groups. But more on that later. That's kind of like the introductory to the world, if you will. So, in the book Clockwork Angel, you find a character named Tessa Gray, or Teresa Gray, and she basically believes she is nothing but a mundane. She has no idea about the shadow hunters or the downworld or anything like that, and she is basically thrust into this world out of nowhere, kidnapped and put through all these series of tests. And as it turns out, her family has a history in downworld, and there's all kinds of mysteries about who Tessa actually is and where she comes from, which you don't find out until the end of this trilogy. And even then, there's certain details that aren't revealed at the end of this trilogy, but revealed in other books. But Tessa, through these tests, discovers that she has a unique ability to transform into other people. but it goes a level deeper than that. Not only can she physically transform into the shape of another, she can take an object that belonged to that person and reach for the essence of the person who owned that object, and she can literally become that person, have access to their memories and everything else. And sometimes the different ones she transforms into can problematically almost take her over for a moment or two. And so she's trying to figure out how to control her power to where she stays in control. But you meet some interesting characters along the way in this story. Like there's the two demons that kidnapped her. One of them's name is Mrs. Dark, and I think the other one was Mrs. Black, if I remember correctly. And there are a couple of sinister characters that cause problems. But you also encounter two Shadowhunters that quickly become favorites in all of the books, and that's Jim Carstairs or James Carstairs and Will Herondale. And they then the two of them are parabatai, and they basically take it upon themselves to rescue Tessa and protect her while also trying to figure out what in the heck she is. And they theorize that she is a warlock, but the only problem with that is that she doesn't bear a warlock's mark. Typically, when someone is a warlock, they have a mark on their body that signifies that they are a warlock, whether it be a set of horns or crazy colored eyes or claws, something of that nature. Like, there's a warlock that has entirely blue skin. Her name's Katarina Loss, and she's a healer. But typically, they can showcase their abilities through glowing magical abilities type of thing. But you go through all kinds of fascinating adventures, and you eventually meet a character that ends up becoming the main villain in this series, and that's Mortmain. But the interesting thing about what he has to do with all of this is that the Shadowhunters are also constantly being attacked by these metallic creatures called automatons, which are basically clockwork robots, if you will. And as the series progresses, you see the bodies and the physical forms of these clockwork creatures slowly becoming more and more advanced and more well designed as Mortmain figures his designs out. But an interesting thing to note, and coincides with the title of this book, is that Tessa has a necklace that is a clockwork angel with quite literal inner cogs and clockwork workings, and it ticks and all this stuff. But you also discover that there's more to this necklace than meets the eye. It actually has the abilities to do these extraordinary things in times of dire need, especially where Tessa is concerned. And you find out the secret behind the necklace itself, I believe, in the third book of this trilogy, if I remember correctly. And just, that big reveal with that was just so freaking amazing. But yeah, it's quite a fascinating book, and there's other shadow hunters that you meet that become a part of our main group. But as any fan of the Shadow Hunters novels will tell you, Tessa and Jim especially become extraordinary favorites in all of the books. But I'll go into more of that in some other videos as I review the other trilogies. Um, but there's also a couple of other problems that our heroes are dealing with, and I'm gonna go and hop into Clockwork Prince, which is the second book of this series. And Jim is in a bit of a bind himself. So when he was a kid, I believe his parents were killed by a demon, and said demon also poisoned Jim. And the only, not cure, but mitigator, if you will, is a drug called Yin which is a drug in Downworld that is harvested from vampire venom, I believe. And if you see anyone who's addicted to that substance over time, their hair turns white. And at this point in the story, Jim's hair is almost completely white. I don't even think he has a black strand left in it, really. He might. But so not only is this mitigating the demon poison, but the Yin is also slowly killing him. And as the series progresses, he's becoming weaker and weaker. And his Parabatai Will has his own problems as well. He, due to an unfortunate experience as a child where he accidentally released a demon from a Pixis, which is a box, he is under the impression that anyone that he loves will eventually die due to some curse that that demon placed upon him. But there's more on that revealed as time goes along, and you really just find out all the pain that Will has been going through all this time. And yeah, I won't spoil any of that for you. It's so convoluted of a storyline. It's really amazing how all the different things work alongside each other, all the different storylines and things that are happening. But the last book of the series, and if you've noticed each cover, on the first one you have Will Herondale on the first cover, you have James Carstairs or Jim on the second cover, and then you finally have Tessa herself on this cover. And as showcased on the cover here, just like on the first one, there's her clockwork angel necklace, and she's got a book in her hand. She's also, crazy about books. She's a big bookworm, and she would have liked to have fainted in Beauty and the Beast style when Will and Jim showed her the library of the Institute. And the Institute is basically like the headquarters of the Shadowhunters. You have basically the Shadowhunters have their own home country, which is known as Idris. And I don't believe you actually see Idris in this trilogy in person. That comes in other series, if I remember right. But Idris is their home country, and it's protected by demon towers, so nothing demonic can enter the city or anything like that. There's various mansions in the landscape around the city of Alicante. I think that's how you pronounce that. Could be totally wrong. But in the wilderness of Idris or Broslin Forest, you have all kinds of tribes of vampires, werewolves, fae even, but there's many different mansions that belong to different notable Shadowhunter families of wealth. And you'll learn more and more that there's certain prominent families of Shadowhunters like Herondale, Carstairs, Fairchild, Morgenstern, and those will find greater significance as you go through the series. But the institutes are actually outposts, if you will, and they exist all around the world. There's one in New York, there's one in London, there's one in, I believe, Buenos Aires, and there's one in Japan, etc., etc. And each of those have their own local groups of shadow hunters that are basically keeping things in check and all of that. And so the fortunate side is the various races have agreed to a set of laws known as the Accords, and they meet every so often to ratify them and renew them pretty much and discuss the terms thereof. And it's really just an interesting political environment as well. So the local groups of shadow hunters in each institute are known as the conclave, or just the clave, I believe. And the main group of shadow hunters in Idris, where they all gather together to discuss what actions they're going to take in certain times of crisis or when decision making needs to happen. They have conclaves, I believe is what it's called. But you learn more of that in later books. But obviously, Tessa has to grapple not only with her abilities and the threat of Mortmain and the clockwork creatures, but also the Clave trying to decide what to make of her. And that can be potentially dangerous for her. Um, but there's also a great amount of debate as to who Tessa's demon father actually is, which is a greater demon, as it turns out. But you don't find out who or what he is, even in this trilogy. That remains a mystery to be revealed later on. But everything kind of comes to a head at this point. Mortmain's making his moves. His automatons are attacking various locations of shadow hunters, and our main group of heroes are having to come together in order to defeat this threat once and for all. And there's one character I haven't mentioned yet that I absolutely adore in this series, and that's Magnus Bane. Yeah, I can't have a book review. I can't have a book review in this universe without mentioning him. He's one of my favorite characters, and he's a warlock, but he's also pretty much the most powerful warlock around. His father was a greater demon as well, and you'll learn more about what class of warlock they are in a later series I'm going to review. But he has got probably the best lines out of any character in any of these books. He's got the best one-liners and comments that he makes, these snide remarks, because he's got the confidence and the power to back it up. And he's constantly helping the Shadowhunters deal with things or to handle certain, issues, things like that. But he's not going to do it for free, of course, except for with the people that he actually likes, like Will Herondale, Tessa, all of them. But there may be accords kind of governing the laws and everything, but relations between Downworld and the Shadowhunters are still tense at best. So there's all kinds of problems that, our main people are always having to tread through just because of the political environment itself. And you come to learn through reading all these books that every group and every person has their own point of view on how things should be. And that doesn't always line up across the board. But yeah, this is a super fun read to be introduced to the series, and I'm honestly glad that I started with this trilogy because this is basically the earliest in the timeline that we go for the most part. And it has so many references in the later books that reference this trilogy in particular. And it's so fun going through the books later in the timeline and to see things like, oh, I know what that was, and that's from this, and oh, they're talking about this character, and oh my gosh, this character's still alive at this point. Things like that. And it's really just fascinating to just, wade through this world that Cassandra Clare has weaved together. Like, it's about as detailed in its world building and detail as J.K. Rowling was in building the Wizarding World. But yeah, it's really quite fascinating how all the different events across the timeline line up, especially when they start jumping to other universes later on. But I'm not going to go into it any further today. I think I've laid a pretty good groundwork. So stay tuned for my other book reviews in this series. It's probably going to be another 4 or 5 videos on that just to cover all of them. And I'm going to try and go in the order in which I read them for the most part. But yeah, hope you guys enjoy and everyone have a great day.